Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. It always began with a long walk from the edge of the farmland, past the thatched roofs of the settlement, beyond the clustered stones where pigs rooted and children shouted. The judge would walk alone or with one apprentice, carrying a wooden staff, a cloak, and the memory of generations. He wasn't a judge in the modern sense. He was a brihan, a word that hums with moss and law, not law by decree, law by memory, law by tree. Uznich isn't the center of Ireland, but it's close enough that people used to say it was. A low rise surrounded by bog and bush. On its shoulder sat a lone tree. Some said it was a hawthorn, others a twisted ash hand beneath it. For hundreds of years, people settled disputes by sleeping, not immediately, not for comfort, not out of laziness or faith. They slept as part of the ritual of decision-making. Let's go back to the year 784, a wet year, fog-heavy and unusually cold for midsummer. Crops had failed along the Shannon's low banks. In Leinster, wolves were reported prowling near villages in the early mornings. But in Uznich, a dispute had risen. Not over cattle or land, but over truth. A farmer named Quan claimed his neighbor. Turlock had moved a boundary stone overnight. Quan had grazed cattle on the disputed strip for generations. Turlock said the field was always his. They both believed what they were saying, so they went to the brihan, and the brihan, as was the custom, walked to Uznich, the brihan's tools unlike Roman or Norman judges. The brihan brought no scrolls, no written laws. Everything was memorized, verses committed to memory by years of oral instruction. Every possibility cataloged. What happens if a black cow breaks a gate? Or a wife leaves a marriage without witnesses? Or a tree is cut that shades a common path? There were no punishments in the way, might imagine. No prison sentences, no jails. Instead, honor and restitution. You paid in cattle and silver rings, in bundles of barley, and if you could not pay, your kin paid for you, or you lost your place in the tribe. But when the law was unclear, or the claims conflicted without evidence, they slept. The ritual of sleeping judgment tit was called Codlet na Firin, the sleep of truth. Quan and Turlock both arrived with their kin. There was no shouting, no presentation of cases. That had happened already days earlier in the brihan's ear, recited plainly just once. Now, each man would lie beneath the sacred tree, facing the trunk, wrapped in their cloaks. The brihan would lie beside them, and they would sleep under the starsor, in this case, under the light rain that had begun to mist over the hill. The idea was this: in the absence of new evidence, truth would come in dreams. To the outsider, it seems absurd, but for the Irish of the time, it made sense. Dreams were part of life, not in the Freudian sense, not symbolic or psychological. Dreams were a thin space where the breath of the land touched the soul of the person. The sacred tree was an antenna. It had witnessed generations of honesty in dispute. Its roots fed on secrets and confessions. So, when one slept beneath it with a clear heart, it was believed the truth would emerge, sometimes in words, sometimes in feeling. The brihan would wake first. He would not ask what the men dreamt. He would simply look at them, ask them each to speak a single sentence. Then he would decide, hey, law without force, what makes this most strange is what followed. Obedience. There were no guards, no enforcers. If the brihan said, Quan must move his cattle, then Quan did. If the brihan said, Turlock must pay for heifers. Then Turlock paid. If he said, neither is right, split the field. Then it was done. Why? Because the Brehon had no army. He had no jail to put you in. His power was trust, and that trust was maintained by consistency, by memory, and by the sacred trees. It was said that trees never lie. If the tree bore witness to a sleeping judgment, and the Brehon pronounced truth, to violate it was to invite not only disgrace, but ruin. Crops might fail, children might sicken, neighbors would not look you in the eye. You'd be an anchored soul, no longer part of the living earth. A culture rooted in trees. Medieval Ireland loved its trees. There were 5 sacred trees of Ireland believed to be planted by druids or brought from the other world. These weren't just markers, they were living witnesses. Under the Brehon laws, certain trees were considered of noble rank. The Eric Fido lords of the forest included oak, hazel, holly, ash, and yew too. Damage one could incur a fine equal to the worth of a milk cow. Cutting one down without cause, an act just short of treason. Why? Because these trees weren't just flora. They were legal entities. They had presence. They had authority. If a contract was made in their shadow, stood. If a child was named beneath them, the name held. If a crime was confessed before them, the land remembered. And the rain fell soft that night in 784. The rain didn't stop. The apprentices held up wool cloaks to block the wind. Teared, sea wind shivered. Turlock said nothing. The Brehon lay still. Sometime near dawn, a blackbird landed on the tree. It hopped 3 times along the lowest branch, sang once. Quan wept in his sleep. The Brehon opened his eyes. When he stood, the others rose. They were soaked. Mud clung to their legs. Their hair was plastered against their heads. They were cold, dirty, miserable, and yet something in their faces had changed. Not guilt, not shame, not even clarity, but settlement. The judgment. Keyes said, let the stone stand where it lies. He said nothing else. Quan nodded. Turlock blinked. Then they walked home, separately. No paperwork was filed. No guards were sent. The land did not shift. But in the days to come, the village adjusted. A new path was beaten around the disputed field. Children learned not to run across it, and the cows grazed carefully, as if they too remembered. The sacred tree of Uznich no longer stands. No one knows when it died. Some say it was burned by English soldiers. Others say it was felled by accident. But the hill remains, and if you stand on its shoulder during the right kind of dusk, with the wind brushing your ears and no voices nearby, you might almost feel it. It's a memory of law, the silence of sleep, the weight of a decision made in the rain. It's tempting to romanticize the Brehon system as if Ireland, lost in the mists of time, had stumbled onto a kind of utopia where men judged fairly beneath the trees, where no one raised a sword, and where disputes dissolved in sleep. But this isn't a bedtime fantasy. It was much slower, much stranger, and far more fragile. In this section, we'll go deeper, not into a single moment of judgment, but into the roots that held the Brehon system together for over 1,000 years. A legal world that had no jails, no kings to enforce verdicts, no police, only memory, land, kinship, and silence. A world where trees were not symbols, but legal infrastructure. Let's begin with how law lived, not in books, but in the bodies of a few chosen people. The Brehons. Law without papery. Brehon wasn't elected. He wasn't appointed by a lord. He didn't hold office in a castle or wear a robe. Instead, the role passed through training, memory, and reputation. From as early as the 7th century, Keons were selected young, often born into legal families and trained for decades in oral law. They didn't learn just rules, they learned. Versus whole catalogs of conditions, payments, exceptions, and customs. For example, if a man's pig damages another man's barley crop in the second week of harvest season, and the pig is unmarked and the fence is broken, how much must he pay? Who owes what if the pig was owned jointly? And what if the barley was for brewing ale for a feast? All of this had an answer, memorized in layers, and it was stored in the mind. To speak Brehon law was to perform it. Each case summoned generations of legal phrasing, carefully preserved and publicly recited. Imagine living in a world where forgetting a line meant a miscarriage of justice, where the law was not written on stone or parchment, but inside your breath. That was the Brehon world, legal trees, a forest of customs. But the law was not only in the Brehon, it lived in trees. Each type of tree had a rank under the legal code, known as Bretha Komithesa, the judgments of neighborhood. Trees were categorized into 4 groups: Eric, Phaedo, nobles of the wood, oak, ash, yew, hazel, holly; Athig, Phaedo, commoners of the wood, alder, willow, rowan; Fadla, Phaedo, lower class trees, blackthorn, elder, spindle; Loza, Phaedo, the brushwood, bramble, fern, dog rose. Each had assigned fines if damaged or destroyed. To harm a noble tree could cost as much as 2 full milk cows, depending on the season and whether the tree stood on communal land. But it wasn't about ecology, it was about place. A tree, to the medieval Irish, wasn't just wood and leaf, it was a marker of obligation. People met under certain trees, not for shade, but because that tree had once witnessed a debt repaid, a marriage sealed, or a judgment made. Its roots drank the memory, spark held the names of witnesses. This is why the Brehon might ask to meet beneath the hazel that faces west, or under the 3rd oak of the elder grove. It wasn't poetry, it was location-based law. Why they slept sleeping beneath the tree wasn't superstition. It was a cultural truth ritual in the Irish worldview, especially in early medieval times. Soul was porous. At night, it slipped loose, and in dreams, it wandered not into fantasy, but into the other world. It's a realm not unlike our own, but clearer, quieter, closer to truth in the Brehon legal mind. When someone slept beneath a sacred tree, especially after stating their case, they relinquished control. If they lied, it would rise in their sweat or show in their muttering dreams. If they told the truth, the land would hold it, and the Brehon, trained to watch more than to speak, would see what the tree saw in some cases. The ritual lasted for multiple nights. When a case was deeply tied to land, such as claims about ancestral burial grounds or border stones, the sleeping ritual could last 3 evenings under 3 different trees. It wasn't efficiency they valued, it was presence. To settle a dispute with speed was to risk injustice, but to settle it with slowness, rain, mud, wind, and silence was to ensure it would last. Kinship and collective responsibility, of course, it only worked because the community agreed to play along. If Turlock refused to obey the judgment, what would happen? No one would jail him, no soldier would come, but he would lose his honor. Priest's central concept in Brehon law. Everyone had an honor price, a value based on kin, standing, profession, and truthfulness. If you violated a judgment, you lost it. You couldn't marry upward. You couldn't collect debts. No one owed you hospitality. You became invisible to the legal world. And worse, your kin had to cover your debts. This made law collective. If you harmed someone, your family helped repay it. If you were wronged, your family helped demand compensation. It wasn't a system of individual guilt. It was a system of communal balance. And so, a bad judgment didn't hurt just you. It shook your entire tree of kinship, which made people very careful about lying beneath sacred branches. The edge of the empire by the 10th century. Outside, forces began to nibble at the edges of this world. Vikings, with their merchant culture and silver coinage, brought contracts and maritime codes. The church, increasingly Latinized, began pushing for written canon. Land saw dream judgments as pagan leftovers. Eventually, in 1171, King Henry II of England landed in Ireland. With him came Norman clerics, royal courts, and written law. But here's the strange thing. The Brehon system didn't collapse overnight. It lingered quietly in hedgerows, on hillsides, passed down in memory, hidden beneath Latin scrolls and English declarations. As late as the 1500s, there were still Brehons resolving disputes in Gaelic-speaking territories, though now they were seen as anachronisms, relics of a bygone world. The sacred trees had mostly vanished, felled for timber, burned in wars, forgotten in fields. But in a few corners of the island, people still remembered which branch the truth once slept beneath. And that raises a quiet question. Why did it work for so long? A cave, this fragile, word-of-mouth, tree-pound legal world, such power. When empires and armies crumbled. The final echoes of the Brehon world didn't come with a bang. They came with a silence. Not the silence of law books or the roar of English courts, but a different kind of hush, the kind that settles in after the last elder dies who knew the name of the sacred oak. The kind of quiet that hums through a field where the memory of justice no longer stirs the grass. This last section of the first story is not about endings in a traditional sense. It's about disappearance, a slow vanishing of a system, not because it failed, but because it couldn't be written down. We begin in the 16th century, in a stone house near the edge of Connaught, where the Brehons still speak law into firelight. Even as England builds courtrooms in Dublin, Brehon law in the shadow of the Crown in 1577. An English official named Sir John Davies, writing about Ireland's backward laws, made a frustrated observation. There is no written law in this land that the Irish obey. He wasn't entirely correct. Some legal manuscripts, like the Censusmar, had been written in Old Irish centuries earlier, but these texts weren't used like statutes. They were reference guides for Brehons, not blueprints for authority. The real laws, the judgments, customs, and payments still lived inside people, in memory, in ritual, in spoken phrasing, that made them uncontrollable from a crown's point of view. And this was a problem for the Tudor and Stuart administrations, which viewed Ireland's oral law not just as primitive, but dangerous. You couldn't govern what was invisible, so the campaign to end Brehon law began not by fighting it directly, but by outlasting it, discrediting the dream in 1605 as part of England's consolidation of legal authority in Ireland. A declaration was issued forbidding the use of Brehon judges. The justification was that Brehon law was lewd, barbaric, and contrary to God's law. Part of this strategy was religious. The Church of England, like the Catholic Church before it, viewed the practice of sleeping beneath trees to await truth as a form of pagan divination. It wasn't just illegal, it was heretical. And yet, in Gaelic-speaking regions of Ulster and Connaught, the rituals continued quietly. Local lords, still operating outside the Pale, the area directly controlled by the English, often kept hereditary Brehons on staff. Some judgments were issued in full Gaelic ceremony, followed by gifts of land, cattle, or honor payment rather, then royal fines or imprisonment. And still, in the more remote parts of the island, a man accused of trespass might be told to sleep beneath the hazel of memory and trust that the wind would find the truth by dawn. The great forgetting but trees fall, not all at once, but year by year, through storms, axes, and the expansion of farmland between 1600 and 1700. Deforestation in Ireland accelerated as English landlords cleared native woodlands for pasture and shipbuilding. Some trees were felled not for timber, but because they were symbols. An old holly that marked the place where two clans once buried a feud where an oath had been sworn, an ash beneath which generations had married or settled inheritance. These weren't just plants, they were legal markers. When they fell, a memory fell with them. In time, fewer and fewer people remembered which tree stood for which bond. Some of the names lingered, Dare Finn, Sodera, Dorna, and Brightham, but by the 18th century, the meaning of these names faded. They were just sounds on a map now. The system that relied on living geography and oral breath was losing both, and there was no way to stop it. The scribal resistances, tempting to imagine the Brehon system, vanished quietly, like an old song no longer sung. But for a time, there was a last-ditch effort to save it, not in sleep or under trees, but in ink. A handful of Gaelic scribes began recording what they remembered of the legal traditions. They translated verses, annotated old manuscripts. They tried to pen the floating knowledge to paper. One of these men was the Baltoch Mac Verbiciza, a 17th century scribe from County Sligo, who compiled massive genealogies and notes on customary law, knowing full well that the system he wrote about was collapsing even as he inked it. His work wasn't read by courts, it was read by no one for a long time, but it lingered in centuries, later in archives and collections. His words would help scholars reconstruct what had nearly vanished. Still, the truth remained. No matter how much he wrote down, the heart of Brehon law had always lived in ritual setting, in the slow passage of time beneath the trees, that couldn't be captured in a book, only remembered. What was lost in what wasn't be the 19th century. When English law had been firmly established across Ireland, Brehon law became something to study, not to practice. Academics began calling it an interesting relic. Legal historians classified it as restorative justice ahead of its time. Anthropologists noted its sophisticated system of collective responsibility, and poets like W.B. Yeats romanticized its spiritual depth, the hazels of wisdom, the sleeping truths, the music of old names. But perhaps that's missing the point. The point isn't that it was elegant or mystical. The point is that it worked for 1,000 years across a society without a central government or standing army, a system where no judge raised a gavel, where no jail held a man, and where the final word was often whispered by rain through leaves, while a community listened to a sleeping man's breath. So, when we ask why medieval Irish lawmakers slept near sacred trees, the real answer might be this: because they trusted the land to remember, not just the facts or the crime or the complaint, but the balance, the silence, the truth. And as we move on to new systems, fast, efficient, digital, we might pause to ask, what did we lose when law stopped sleeping beneath the trees? Ireland, 1722. The British Parliament was busy debating wool exports. Lords and powdered wigs fussed over trade privileges. In Dublin, the Anglican elite worried about Jacobite plots, about far from courts or castles, in a thatched farmhouse outside Kilkenny, a woman named Mare Nea stirred cabbage soup and kept the entire record of her parish's land agreements. In her head, she wasn't a lawyer. She didn't carry scrolls or legal stamps. She couldn't write in English and only barely read Irish script. But for 3 neighboring townlands, clusters of tenant farms passed between Catholic families for generations. She was judge, memory, and archive all in one. If you wanted to know how much rent your uncle paid in 1688, if you wanted to contest a cousin's claim to a potato ridge, if you needed to settle a marriage dowry or grazing rights, you went to Mare and she'd tell you, without notes, over tea. After the fall of the Brehons, the early 1700s, traditional Gaelic law had been largely suppressed. The Brehons were gone, the sacred trees cut down or forgotten, and the English legal system had spread across the Irish countryside through landlord courts, tithes, and eviction threats. But here's the thing, law didn't die. It moved from public rows and ceremonial gatherings, 2 kitchens, hearths, memories in rural Ireland, where Catholic tenants could not hold land officially and court records were kept in a foreign tongue. Legal memory had to go underground, and women like Mare, quiet, overlooked, usually dismissed. Unofficial accounts became the unofficial archivists of everything. She wasn't unique. In townlands from Kerry to Donegal, many older women served as custodians of local law, particularly where formal record-keeping was blocked or discouraged by law. They remembered marriages. They remembered debts. They remembered whether on the day a lease was signed, because that was how oral markers worked. You didn't say April 17th, 1689. You said the Wednesday after the red cow calved, the day of the heavy rain, and Myrrh would nod. She remembered that rain. The law beneath the law. Let's be clear. These women weren't recognized by British legal authorities. They didn't sit in court. They weren't allowed to vote or own land, but in practice, they were vital to the function of rural landholding. Tenancy in 18th century Ireland was a fragile, undocumented thing for most Catholics. Penal laws restricted Catholic land ownership. So many leases were informally agreed upon verbally, passed down within families, and often honored only through local consensus. If no one remembered what was agreed, if no one could confirm who planted the hedge that marked a boundary, then chaos could break out. Mare's genius wasn't just in remembering facts, it was in holding relationships steady. She knew who disliked whom. She knew who had forgiven what. She knew what promises were whispered at funerals, and who had cried when their field was repossessed. And so, when disputes flared, she'd invite both parties to her kitchen. She'd serve oatcake. She'd listen, and she'd say, in that slow, a thoughtful voice of hers, "No, Seamus, that was not your father's ridge. It belonged to Donica, but he led your uncle sow oats there once during the famine winter. You know this, and because Myrrh said it, became truth. Why no one wrote it down? Why didn't someone write all this down? Some did, priests, scribes, traveling schoolmasters, but for most tenant families, writing meant danger. A written lease could be used against you. A name on paper could mean eviction if the landlord changed his mind. A signed agreement could be twisted in a court that didn't speak your language or recognize your customs. So instead, think trusted the oldest system in Ireland, memory through community. And women like Myrrh were trusted because they didn't seek power. They didn't threaten. They didn't charge money. They held knowledge, not for control, but for stability, to remember what others would forget, to guard the details. That made peace possible, to carry law not as authority, but as service. A quiet legal system. You asked a London barrister in 1722 how land law worked in Kilkenny. He might have said, through contracts and courts. He would have been wrong. In practice, landholding was governed through layered understandings, half-stated truths, rumored favors, seasonal rhythms, and emotional bonds that had the force of law. Even if no judge recognized them, Mare wasn't issuing verdicts. She was weaving memory into reality, one conversation at a time. When a widow's claim to pasture land was challenged, Mare might recall that her husband had once saved the cousin of the land's previous tenant. That gratitude had turned into a verbal promise, and though that cousin was now dead, Mare remembered that promise still stood. And so the pasture was hers, not because of a deed, but because Mare remembered the story. Resistance through recollection. What was happening here was not just survival. It was resistance by maintaining memory-based land law. Women like Myrrh were preserving a version of Gaelic justice under the surface of British control. It didn't look dramatic. No speeches, no rebellions, just quiet conversations in kitchens. But it was powerful, because every time a community honored Mare's memory of a lease instead of appealing to a magistrate, they were asserting a parallel system of justice, one not written in English, One not housed in stone buildings. One not backed by force, but by trust. And every time she passed on a legal detail to a younger niece or neighbor, she wasn't just gossiping, she was training the next memory keeper, the next guardian of the unwritten record. As we leave this quiet kitchen in Kilkenny, in the world of Mur and Domhnall, we're left with a question. In an age obsessed with documentation, signatures, and digital trails, what happens when the real authority still lives in someone's memory? There was no official courtroom in the little hamlet where Mary Neal lived. No judge's bench, no gavel, no rows of solemn benches packed with observers. The closest thing to a legal forum was the corner of Mur's hearthroom, where the morning light hit the whitewashed wall just so. That's where she'd usually settle land disputes, leaning on her elbow, kneading dough, or tending to a child in the cradle as she recalled stories others had forgotten. But make no mistake, those conversations were trials in all but name, and in rural Ireland, especially in areas far from towns, the K carried more authority than anything written by a notary. How memory became legal proof might seem strange. K, from a modern perspective, to imagine a society where a person's recollection could stand in for a contract. But in Gaelic tradition, oral testimony had always been central, long before the Norman invasion. Brehon law was administered not in writing, but through a carefully preserved oral code, passed from generation to generation. Even when elements of English common law seeped into Ireland during the Tudor and Stuart periods, these oral practices endured, especially where people didn't trust the written word. Why? Because writing could be altered, 'cause ink could be forged, and signatures coerced, 'cause English law, with its wigs and Latin phrases, didn't recognize the complexity of human trust. Mur remembered things not as isolated facts, but as stories woven into one another. And this is what gave her memory power. If she remembered that Padraig planted potatoes on the McGrath field during the summer after his brother's drowning, that meant something. It placed Padraig on the land. It established a precedent when people argued about rights, not just to land, to paths, walls, wells, orchards, and even sunlight between cottages. They brought their stories to her. Mare would listen patiently and let them finish. Then she would begin to stitch their present claims into the larger quilt of the past. She'd say something like, "No, that gate was moved before your grandfather's time. Psst. When the big wind flattened the western hedge, your great-uncle helped rebuild it." Don't you remember the song they sang? That was the evidence. Not just memory, but anchored memory, set against weather. Funerals, crops, births, and ballads. Witnesses who never spoke. The walls of Mur's kitchen were unpainted stone. The windows were small and thick with damp. A black kettle always sat above the fire, steaming with barley water or thin broth. Chickens clucked just beyond the threshold, and in the late evenings, the glow of embers would cast her face in long shadows. It was here that she did her work, and the participants, her visitors, were neighbors, notaries of the unwritten world. Some came alone. Others brought kin to support their claims. But in truth, Mary needed no crowd. Her witnesses were everywhere. The wind that tore off the roof, the year of the sheep plague, the apple tree that never blossomed again after the widow's curse, the moss on the eastern stones that marked how far the spring used to reach. Mur would nod toward the old hearth or lift her chin in the direction of the barn and say, "Look at the beam over the door, the blackened one." That was when the fire came, before Eamon's second daughter married. That's when the field was swapped. And everyone present would remember, not the document, cut, the moment. Even if they hadn't lived it, they'd heard the story. They'd felt its weight, and that was enough. Disputes as memory puzzles. One morning, a man named Colm arrived, red-faced and breathless. He was fuming about his cousin's claim to a hayfield that had been in his family for decades. Mare didn't flinch. She asked him to sit. She offered tea and asked when he last remembered stacking hay in that field. He muttered something about the year the priest lost his voice. The year the sea froze in Waterford. Ah, yes. Mare remembered that winter. She remembered the snow on the gables and the silence at Mass. Then she asked, softly, who cut the first furrow that spring? Combe paused. His fury faded. He looked downward. Your cousin Mare answered for him, with your father's permission. Because you were ill. You had the fever. She smiled gently. You know this, Combe. He sowed the rye for you, okay? And you gave him the field for 2 years. And so, the ownership question wasn't really about legal title. It was about honor, memory, reciprocity. Mare wasn't resolving property rights. She was restoring shared understanding when memory was threatened, but memory has enemies. As English legal culture spread deeper into the countryside, along with landlords, rent collectors, and new parish registers, women like Mare became increasingly marginalized. Their oral authority was not written, so it could be ignored or challenged in formal courts. Sometimes, when young tenants tried to assert written contracts obtained from landlords, Mare's memory would be dismissed as superstition or senility. But she held her ground in one famous episode, later recalled in parish lore. A visiting magistrate tried to resolve a boundary issue using a faded lease written in English. Date 1703. The parties involved couldn't read it. Mare, who had been present the day the original boundary was agreed, challenged the document. The line followed the stone path to the blackthorn. She insisted. The lease says otherwise, but that was never honored. It was changed after. The landlord left for Cork. Everyone knows this. The magistrate scoffed, but when 3 older tenants repeated her version, and a child, who'd been told the story by her grandmother, corroborated it, the magistrate relented. He said, reluctantly, let the boundary stand as the people remember it. And so memory prevailed. Not by law, but by force of consensus. Legacy passed by whispers. Mare aged. Her sharpness did not fade. If anything, her memory deepened. Children would sit at her feet as she kneaded dough, and she would point to fields, walls, wells, giving names not written on any map. That tree, the split ash, that's where Bridget wept when her son didn't return. That gate used to be north-facing before the blight. That field once held barley so golden it burned in the morning sun. And so, her knowledge passed to the next generation, not as instruction, but as story. It's lived memory embedded in narrative. Some of it faded, some of it grew twisted, but the essence endured. Mare Undumnell never held a title deed, never swore an oath in a courtroom, and never wrote a legal opinion. But for decades, our neighbors went to sleep knowing that someone, just one woman, remembered it all. And as the centuries turned and her name faded into parish myth, one can't help but wonder, what do we lose when our laws are no longer stored in people, but in paper? By the end of her life, Mare Undumnell had become something of a relic in her own time, cherished. Yes, but quietly obsolete. As the 19th century wore on, and the reach of official British law deepened across Ireland, the world that had once relied on women like Mare began to drift away. The fences she remembered so clearly were replaced. The rents she recited from memory were recalculated and typed in ledgers, and the people who once came to her hearth for truth began instead to take the train to town and wait outside stone courthouses. It was not so much a sudden loss as it was a slow forgetting. The land was changing. The very concept of land was changing. Under Brehon law, the idea of personal ownership was less rigid. Land was held in trust by a kin group, defined and redistributed depending on need, age, and labor. People didn't own a field. They stewarded it. They remembered who had dug it first, who had cut turf from it, who had sung to it under a full moon. Mare knew these stories like scripture. And so, for her, Land was not a commodity, it was a biography. But British land reform brought new frameworks, property taxes, individual titles, foreclosure. Suddenly, land needed fixed boundaries, written deeds, and names in ink. And in this new world, stories no longer held legal weight. Mare watched these changes like she watched the seasons. She did not rage against them, but she noted their shape. She could name the exact year when the last family on the eastern ridge fenced off a spring that had once been shared. She remembered when a hedge was planted, not to protect a field, but to mark a claim. That hedge, she would say, softly, was the beginning of forgetting. The last dispute, she settled it, was a cold March morning when the last real land question was brought to her hearth. Two sisters, twins in their 40s, stood in her doorway with shawls pulled tight around their shoulders. Their mother had died, and both believed they were owed the stone cottage at the edge of the field. Mare was nearly 80. Her joints ached. Her voice had grown thinner, and her eyes, once so sharp, were now dim under their hooded lids. Her mind was intact. When she looked at the sisters, she didn't see their faces now. She saw their birth, their mother's laughter, the way the roof of that cottage had been rebuilt in 1839 after the storm that cracked the western wall. She asked them to sit. She offered oat cake and a little broth. And then she spoke. She reminded them how the cottage had been promised, not to a name, but to a function, that whoever cared for the elder, meaning Mare herself, would be granted the house. It was agreed long ago, in front of the village midwife and 3 neighbors. When the younger sister had left for Limerick and the elder stayed to tend the hearth, it wasn't about fairness. It wasn't about documents. It was about honoring what had been said and what had been done. The sisters left quietly, and later, a fresh sod of turf appeared at Mare's doorstep, left by the elder. That was the last judgment she ever made. The return of the scribes. By 1860, new scribes had arrived, not the wandering alums of old, but clerks with spectacles and wax stamps. They carried pocket watches and ledgers. They wore coats instead of cloaks, and they cared little for songs or field markings. To them, memory was unreliable. The children of the village who had once gathered at Mare's feet now learned English in schoolrooms and were taught to read newspapers from Dublin. Latin phrases replaced Irish idioms. Local knowledge was no longer prized unless it could be cross-referenced in a ledger. Mare was still respected. Her name was still invoked in moments of conflict. But slowly, fewer came to visit. Even the moss-covered stones she once used to explain boundary lines were ignored, or worse, removed. She began to speak her memories aloud, even when no one was listening. Her final seasoning, the autumn of her 84th year. Mare stopped leaving the cottage. Her world had grown small. A single window, the orange flicker of firelight, and the rhythm of the seasons told in the creak of timbers. The outside world was loud with change, but inside her mind, the past moved in slow circles. She could still name the tenants of every field within 10 miles. Still remember who died in childbirth in 1812, who survived the hunger of 1847, who owed whom 3 stone of oats in 1796. She was the last living archive of a forgotten legal system, not one built on enforcement, but on agreement, not rooted in a punishment, but in balance. A child brought her soup one winter day. Mare took it, nodded, and said, "Tell your mother the rent was always oats, not coin. Oats, and 1 egg at Samhain." The child didn't understand. The day she was going there was no fanfare when she died. Just the soft hush of recognition across the village. Her death was quiet, but its weight was enormous, because, with Mare's passing, hundreds of years of memory, precedent, agreement, and understanding vanished. There were no books, no scrolls, just stories. And now, many of those stories had no speaker in the weeks after her burial. 3 disputes arose that would have once been brought to her hearth. Instead, the families went to the town solicitor. None of the judgments were satisfying. None of them took into account the generations of lived knowledge. The field boundary was redrawn. The path was closed. The rent changed to coin. The hearth, as archived today, nothing marks the spot where Myrrh once sat. The cottage was torn down sometime before the turn of the century. A new house stands there now, modern and square, with electricity and tile floors. No, one remembers that the wall behind the stove once held the oral history of a people. No one remembers the song about the wind that moved the gate. But maybe, it's just maybe, a few stones in the field still remember where they once stood. A tree line still leans the way it did after the storm. A mossy path still curves where feet once walked toward judgment, not from law books, but from living memory. And so, the question lingers: what truths are buried in people, not paper, and what have we already lost by failing to ask? It began, as many things did in early medieval Ireland, with a cow. Not just any cow. She was white-furred and horned, marked by a speckled nose and long, slow eyes. She belonged to a farmer named Eachide, a quiet man who mended his own fences and rarely spoke unless spoken to. His fields sat along a bend in the River Boyne, where the grass grew thick and full thanks to centuries of patient flooding. The cow, known in the village simply as Datha, meaning the colored one, had been in his herd for nearly 12 years, long enough that some claimed she had become more myth than beast. But one morning in the middle of spring, just after the first red buds had come to the hawthorn trees, Datha wandered across an invisible boundary. She stepped onto the land of another man, Fachna, a recent arrival and landholder of questionable origin. He claimed rights to the adjacent pasture based on a title granted by a provincial lord, a document sealed with wax in Latin, Eochade, however, maintained that the field in question had been shared since his grandfather's day. No walls, no barriers, it's the mutual understanding passed down from mouth to mouth. And so, when Datha crossed that line and grazed, perhaps for only a minute or two, the air itself seemed to shift. That evening, Fachna tethered the cow behind his barn and sent word to Eoche that the animal had trespassed and would not be returned unless a fine was paid. Eoche refused, not because he denied the event, but because, under the ancient customs, the act did not constitute trespass at all. The law was not written to understand the ripple that followed. You must first understand that medieval Irish law, Rihan law, was not built on written code. It was oral, flexible, and deeply intertwined with kinship, custom, and precedent. The Brehons, or judges, memorized vast sequences of case law, poetic in form, filled with analogies and rhyme, that governed everything from land inheritance to bee swarms. Livestock, this world, was not merely property. It was currency. It was reputation, was proof of a man's standing, his generosity, his obligations. A cow could represent a contract. Calf could secure a marriage. A bull's movement could set a legal process in motion. And Datha was no ordinary cow. She had once been the bride price in a marriage. She had been offered during a famine to another village. She had been identified, time and again, as the animal, involved in at least 3 recorded disputes. She was, in a way, a living scroll, a creature whose very presence reminded the village of the old ways. So, when Fachna refused to return her, it was not simply a theft, it was a challenge to the framework that underpinned their understanding of justice. Calling the Brehonian Cade did not go to the provincial lord. He did not petition the church, though a monastery stood only 4 miles away. Instead, sent for a Brehon, not just any, but Senatig Mac Felb, an aging legal scholar who lived in a roundhouse surrounded by apple trees, far from any royal center. Senatig was known for quoting 30-year-old cases, word for word, and for refusing to drink ale during legal consultations. A rare trait among his peers. When Senatig arrived 2 days later, he did not ask for documents. He did not wear robes. He brought no ink or parchment. Instead, he sat on a wooden stool in the middle of the disputed field and listened. He asked no questions at first. He let Iachade speak, then Fachna, then Iachade again, then the neighboring farmers, then the man who once delivered calves for Datha and claimed to remember which corner of the field she preferred for grazing. Senatig chewed on a reed and nodded, occasionally murmuring lines from ancient judgments like, "The beast knows no walls where none have been sung," or, "To fence without memory is to fence the sea." And all the while, Datha herself stood beneath an ash tree, chewing placidly, as if waiting for history to catch up. The weight of a Kandar Brihan law. The fine for unlawful retention of a cow was not only measured in restitution, it required honor price, a concept difficult to translate into modern terms. It wasn't just the value of the cow, but the value of the man who lost her, his status, his honor, his role in society. Iachade, though quiet, had once settled land feud between two cousins that could have turned violent. He had been entrusted with 3 orphan boys during the previous winter. He had never raised a complaint nor taken more than his share during seasonal distributions. All of this counted so. When Senatic finally spoke, after 3 days of deliberation, he did not issue a simple command. He issued a restitution ritual. Fachna was to walk the field, barefoot, behind the cow. It was to carry a branch from the hawthorn that marked the ancient boundary. He was to return Datha by hand to Iachade's gate, where she had stood countless times before. And in front of 6 witnesses, he was to offer a milking stool made by his own hand, not because Iachade lacked one, but because crafting it meant time, effort, and humility. Fachna protested. He showed the document from the provincial lord. He pointed to the ink, the seal, the signature. Senatic only blinked and said, "A seal cannot graze. A paper does not chew cud. You came here to farm. You must also live here." It's a ceremony of memory. The restitution ritual was not a spectacle. It was quiet. Mist hung over the field that morning, and only a few children watched from the road. Fachna walked barefoot, branch in hand, as instructed. He muttered under his breath. But when he placed the cow's rope into Iachad's weathered palm, something in the air relaxed. The old boundary was restored, not with ink, but with action. And Senatic, before he left, planted a small stone in the corner of the field. Not a fence, not a border, just a marker, a memory in stone. Asterisk as this strange and nearly forgotten episode of rural law played out. One question rose quietly like morning fog. In a world that values contracts over customs, are we still able to recognize justice when it walks on 4 legs? By the time Senatig Macfelb as sandals had left their gentle imprints in the earth and the cow, Datha was returned to Iachade. The field by the river Boyne was no longer just a strip of grazing land. It had become something heavier. It had absorbed voices, witness, ritual, and refusal. It had become a place marked by memory rather than physical boundary, into the Irish of the 7th century. That was the only mark that mattered in medieval Ireland. There was no centralized court system, no singular king whose word reigned across the island, and certainly no uniform code that everyone followed. Law lived not in scrolls, but in the breath of the Brihan, in the murmurs of the poets, and in the fields walked by livestock and farmers alike. It was oral, ancestral, poetic, and it endured because it was embodied in action. The story of Datha and her return would ripple quietly through the surrounding counties, not through heralds or messengers, but through shared meals, whispered judgments, and the low singing of law poems by firelight. Fachna's name would not be vilified, but it would become a soft caution, a living example of what happens when written claims ignore remembered justice. What a cow could teach for brehons like Senetic. The law wasn't an abstract force. It was a set of remembered patterns, almost like songs, that helped people understand the boundaries of honor, the weight of obligation, and the meaning of living in a shared space. Take the way livestock figured into nearly every kind of agreement. Want to borrow land? You pledged cows. Want to take an apprentice? You offered a calf for each season of their training. Want to form a marriage contract? Cows again, often chosen carefully, not for their size, but for their lineage, health, and how their coloring might reflect family symbolism. The cow was not simply wealth, okay? It was reputation, record keeping, even a kind of legal anchor. A herd was a ledger, alive, breathing, moaning at dusk, and munching through sunrise. Some old brehon judgments even required animals to be paraded as witnesses. A particularly famous one involved a man accused of stealing milk from a widow's cow. Rather than rely solely on human testimony, the brehon asked for the cow to be brought before him. If she responded to the accused man's voice, as she did, to her owners, it was taken as proof that she had been handled often by him, possibly fed or milked. It was not definitive proof, but it was considered a strand in the web of evidence. It wasn't magic, it was observation, and it required a deeply relational view of the world, where animals weren't objects but living beings, whose actions and preferences had meaning. A field of shadows weeks after Deatha's return, Centig received word the one whose seal adorned Factionless land grant was displeased. Not because he cared much about the cow, but because the brehon's decision had, in a small way, undercut written authority. He had chosen oral law, ancestral law, over the wax and quill, care, judgments of a rising clerical class. Centig replied, not with argument, but with a story. He told of an older dispute, decades past, in which two brothers inherited land from their father. One claimed the western slope based on a charter given by a traveling bishop. The other insisted on the eastern slope, citing the memory of a stone path his father had walked every morning to check his cattle. No one could read the charter. The bishop had long since died, but the slope still bore the shape of the old path, sunken, narrow, worn by generations of feet. In the end, the brehon at the time asked the villagers, "Do you know this path?" They did. Did the father walk it? He did. Does the land remember him? It did. And so the eastern slope was granted, not by ink, but by footprint. Senetic's point was simple. The land carries its own memory. Law must follow that memory, or risk becoming noise. The sleeping stones brehon. Law held a quiet reverence for trees and stones, which often marked the edge of land holdings or served as meeting points for judgments. But these weren't randomly chosen, okay? They were chosen because people remembered them. In E.H. Hade's case, there was an old blackthorn stump, long dead but still rooted at the crest of the field. No one ever touched it. Not because it was magical, but because it had been there when E.H.'s grandfather divided the grazing rights with his cousin. It had witnessed the handshake. It had heard the terms spoken aloud. To remove it would be to erase that memory, so it remained. When disputes arose, brehons sometimes slept beside such trees, not out of mysticism, but out of respect for memory. The idea was that law didn't live in the brehon himself. It lived in the earth, and the brehon had to listen slowly, patiently, overnight, if needed, to what had already been laid down through time under a sacred tree. In the silent night, memory could breathe. Honor price and the fabric of community. The concept of honor price remains one of the most uniquely Irish aspects of the old laws. If you harmed someone physically, financially, or even through public insult, the compensation you paid depended not only on the damage done, but on who that person was within the social web. A poet carried a high honor price. So did a foster parent. So did a host who had taken you in during a storm. Your shade, though humble, carried a high honor price because he participated consistently and without complaint. In the quiet weaving of the community, Fachna, on the other hand, arrived with coin and titles, but had yet to truly bind himself to the village. He had not fostered a child. He had not sung a lament at a funeral. He had not mediated a grazing dispute or given tools during harvest. It wasn't about bloodlines. It was about contribution. K and the cow, in this case, simply the spark that revealed the threads. Law in the shape of memory in the months following the dispute. Fachna changed. He began to appear at gatherings. He offered to help with the cutting of peat. He gifted a young calf to a widow whose barn had burned, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, his name stopped being followed by wary looks. One of Senatig's final visits to the village saw Fachna sitting beside Iache at a seasonal feast. They didn't speak much, but they didn't need to. The field had settled. The boundaries had been walked. The memory had been honored in Datha. She had stopped wandering. Maybe the villagers had stopped worrying when she did. As Senatig rode away from the village for the last time, he glanced back at the stone he had planted, still nestled in the grass, still unremarkable to the eye. But he knew the land remembered. And so would the people, long after the cow was gone. How do we carry law today? In papers and passwords? Or in the living patterns of trust that still hold quiet power? There was no grand conclusion to the dispute that had once seemed like it might tear a village apart. No trumpets or public declarations. No scribe pressed pen to parchment to immortalize the case of Datha, the cow. Instead, time itself wrapped the incident in layers of ordinary days, harvesting, mending, brewing, and resting. And in doing so, the event became part of the village's lived law. The Brihand Senatig Macfeld was long gone. He had moved on to mediate disputes about barley rights in Roscommon, and later, a territorial quarrel between monastic tenants near the burn. Yet the shape of his judgment remained, not because he forced it, but because he listened. In doing so, he gave the law back to the land that bore it. What followed in the wake of his departure was the gradual weaving of that judgment into local custom, the highest form of respect in the Brehon tradition. For a law to last in early medieval Ireland, it had to echo through repeated human behavior, not through enforcement. Law didn't live in fear of punishment. It lived in the repetition of what worked, in the memory of what made the village whole again. Datha's new role the months that followed. Datha was no longer just a cow. She was a presence. When new calves were born, villagers would point to her and say, "That's her grand calf." When a child asked why the lower pasture was left unplowed, an elder would reply, "That's Datha's trail. Let it rest." Even when she wandered near Fachina's property, he no longer sent boys to drive her away. He learned, slowly, that her presence didn't weaken his ownership, it dignified it. His land now had a story, and the story had a cow, and the cow had become a kind of living artifact. One day, a traveling monk passed through and asked to buy Datha. She was a fine animal, healthy and well-fed, and he thought she would serve his abbey's needs well. The villagers refused. It wasn't out of reverence for Datha herself, nor a superstitious fear. It was a quiet resistance. To sell her would be to sell the memory, and the law, in this place, still depended on memory. Brehon law in the embodied archive. One of the most misunderstood aspects of early Irish law is that it wasn't designed to be permanent in the way modern laws are. Instead, it was designed to be relational, to arise again and again in each generation through conversation, dispute, and storytelling. A Brehon like Senatig would have memorized hundreds of poetic stanzas called lore tracks, each a miniature archive of prior judgments and proper remedies. These stanzas were often riddling and metaphorical, allowing interpretation, not prescription. One such stanza, preserved in later manuscripts, read, "A cow and calf walks the boundary. Let no man strike the milk from another stream." What does it mean? To the untrained eye, it seems poetic nonsense. But a Brihan would explain, a cow represents livelihood and future wealth. Milk from another stream is a metaphor for unfair gain, taking profit from another's rightful labor. It's a warning against exploitation during boundary negotiations, especially when the landowner's fortune is tied to breeding animals. Such was the genius of Brihan law. It made the abstract tangible by tying it to animals, trees, tools, and seasons, the stuff of daily survival. The tree that listens, the story of Datha, wove itself into the local consciousness. Another element quietly grew in importance, the blackthorn stump. Remembered now as the listening tree, it became the informal site of minor grievances and boundary conversations. If two herders disagreed about grazing rights, they would meet at the stump. If a dowry calf wandered off and there was debate over its return, the listening tree bore silent witness once again. No one claimed it had power, but all agreed it had patience. It had stirred through the dispute, it had heard the words, and, somehow, standing near it made voices softer. This was another essential truth of the Brihan tradition. Space mattered. Where a judgment was delivered, where a hand was shaken, where a calf was born, these things gave shape to legality. Brihans did not rely on thrones or courtrooms. They relied on place memory. A law that lived only in words was half a law. To be whole, it needed to be walked. The night of the foster gathering a year after Senatik's judgment, Fachna hosted a kumpais, a communal feast usually reserved for matters of fosterage, one of the deepest forms of alliance in medieval Irish life. Fosterage wasn't just about raising someone else's child. It was about trust, continuity, and weaving families into each other through shared responsibility. Chade, to everyone's surprise, brought his youngest daughter, Shoma, and sat her beside Fachna's wife. No words were exchanged about the past. Instead, during the feast, Chade stood and recited a simple poem. Once a field held a cow, and the cow held a tail. And now the tail holds the field. May it never be sold. That was all. There was no applause, just silence. It's the kind that acknowledges that something meaningful had just been said, even if no one felt a need to interpret it aloud. 10 bowed slightly, then raised his cup. This, too, was law. What happened to Senatig? Years later, word reached the village that Senatic had gone blind, a common ailment among Brihans who spent their lives scanning the horizon, squinting at facial expressions, and avoiding the reading and writing that came with monastic scribes. But the blindness didn't slow him. He became even more sought after, not because of what he could see, but because of what he remembered. He had become a living archive, a vessel of precedent. When asked how he remembered so much, he replied, "Because I walk with trees and cows, not ink." In the final years of his life, he returned to that same village to resolve a minor quarrel about honey rights. Specifically, whether bees that nested in the hollow of a shared tree belonged to the landholder, or to the person who first placed sugar nearby to attract them. He resolved the matter, predictably, by asking where the bees had nested before the quarrel began. And the stump, still there, still listening. A cow, a field, a future Datha, lived to an old age and died quietly during a frost. She was buried near the listening tree. Villagers gathered not to mourn but to remember. Her grave was never marked with stone. Instead, a narrow ring of small hazel trees was planted around the stump, forming a circle of memory. It was here, under these trees, that young people were later taught about honor price, boundary rights, and the power of silence, not in classrooms, not through scrolls, but by pointing. There, an elder would say, "That's where the field remembered Eochade." There, another would whisper, "That's where Fachna learned the weight of land." And always, someone would eventually say, and that's where death walked. We often imagine law as something imposed. But what happens when law is remembered instead? Not in paper or prison, but in cows, trees, in the quiet way people choose to live together again, even after conflict. There was a time not long ago in the measure of ancient calendars in the dullest corner of a home, the hearth served as both a courtroom and a symbol of justice to the modern eye. The hearth is a place for cooking or warmth. In early medieval Ireland, it was much more. It was a legal marker, a moral compass in the center of personal honor. A single heap of ashes on the floor could become the silent witness to debt, kinship, trespass, or betrayal. In the rural Irish Twatter, the small clan territories that made up the patchwork of the island, law didn't only happen in grand outdoor councils or beside sacred trees. It happened in homes, in kitchens, on beaten clay floors, and under low rafters that held smoke so stubbornly that one could measure age by how deep the soot sank into the grain. This is the story of a household in the lowlands of Munster, one family, one insult, and one pile of ashes, and how, against the backdrop of cows and harvests, justice was found not in speeches, but in the quiet, deliberate care of a kitchen floor. The household of Aid Mac Macnetan was not a king, nor a warrior, nor even a wealthy farmer. He was what people called a co-care seal, a community cook, known for feeding guests and neighbors with equal warmth, often with food that had more imagination than ingredients. His small roundhouse stood near the meeting place of 3 minor roads, where traveling monks, traders, and gossip all passed through like seasonal winds. The walls of his home were made of wattle and daub, the roof thatched with reeds gathered from the bog, too. There were no doors in the modern sense, just thick woolen cloths hung across wooden frames. But at the center of it all, like a settled heartbeat, was the hearth. It was made not from stone, but from layered ash, compacted and ringed, with a few large rocks scavenged from an old crumbled ring fort nearby. The ash was never fully swept. That would be impolite. In Irish custom, some ash must always be left behind. It's a sign that the household was alive, that the fire had roots, and that the home had continuity. And within this ash, certain rules were known. A fresh footstep left in the warm ash of another's hearth meant trespass. A missing mark meant dishonor, as if the hearth had gone cold in silence. A scattered ring of soot beyond the hearthstones could indicate quarrel or theft. Aid understood this language. So did most who visited, but few spoke of it out loud. The insult one evening in Madadam, just before the Samhain festivals that marked the end of the harvest and the beginning of the darker half of the year. Aid hosted a small gathering. There was little ceremony. Warm porridge with hazelnuts, boiled greens, and weak ale brewed from barley ends. Among his guests was a distant cousin named Brannon Mac Arnan, a flax worker, an itinerant juggler known more for his talk than his tact. Brannon had arrived unannounced, and though this wasn't unusual, Aid's wife, Doilig, looked weary. They had already hosted monks the day before and shared their last cured meat earlier that week. Still, tradition demanded Brannon be fed and warmed as the evening wore on. And tongues loosened with ale, Brannon began to boast. He boasted of his knowledge of linen trade. He scoffed at Aid's cooking, saying he used too much water in his porridge, and then, in front of all present, said the words that would linger longer than the smell of peat smoke. Doilig keeps a hearth like a widow's grave cold, gray, and without kindness. Silence fell in the world of legal texts. Such words would be marked as airs, a cutting insult, a verbal wound, not just offensive, but harmful, especially if said within a home, and especially if aimed at the hearth. To insult a woman's keeping of the fire was to question the honor of the house itself. It was to suggest that meals were cold, guests were unwelcome, and the ancestral spirits, for whom the first bite of every stew was traditionally offered, had gone hungry. Aid did not respond in anger, nor did Doilik. Instead, Aid stood, poured a small jug of cold water into the hearth ash, a symbolic gesture. It made a slight hiss, a curl of smoke. The room understood a judgment would be needed, but it would not come tonight. The laws of the hearth, according to the old tracts, especially those preserved in the Bretha, Nemed, Toizak, and later copied by monastic scribes. Insults delivered within the fire circle were not like public disputes. They were deeply personal, yet paradoxically communal. The hearth was the center of both privacy and hospitality. To offend within its ring was to offend the memory of every visitor who had ever been welcomed there. In rural practice, the following rules were generally understood. If an insult is made within the hearth circle, the host may seek compensation in the form of either livestock, labor, or public admission of wrong. If the insult involves fire or food, the insult is doubled in weight, as it touches both survival and honor. If the insult is left unanswered, the hearth is considered shamed, and its future hospitality may be declined by others in the Taith. Aid had no intention of letting it rest, but neither would he retaliate. He would, instead, follow the path of slow justice, the one that began not with a confrontation, but with the reshaping of Ashdod, preparing for judgment 3 days after the insult. Aid swept the hearth, not entirely, but selectively. He cleared the outer ring of stones and left a bare clay outline. Then he gathered new ash from peat burned specifically for the occasion, a symbol of purified fire. He then sent word to find an elderly woman from a nearby village who served as an agil, a private arbitrator in hearth disputes. Not a prihan, not a priest, but someone known for long memory, a clear voice, blue, and the ability to ask questions that made men silent. When she arrived, she did not enter immediately. Instead, she stood outside and asked Aid a question through the woolen cloth. Has the hearth been stirred in bitterness or in witness? Aid replied, in memory, not revenge. Then she entered. Guests arrived quietly, neighbors, other cousins, and a few curious youth who wanted to see whether Brennan would defend himself. Brennan came too, late and with a smirk, but without a gift, another small breach. The circle and the mark to hearing was not loud. No one shouted. There were no raised fists, just slow voices, long silences, and the occasional snap of wood in the fire. Fine asked Brannon to repeat his words. He did, though with less flair. She then asked Doilik if she remembered how she felt. Not hurt, Doilik said, hollowed. Then Ethne took a stick, stirred the ash, and asked Brannon to step into the ring. When he did, she asked him to look down. There, beneath his foot, was a small rock. She asked if he placed it there. He had not. Aid then explained he had placed the rock in the hearth the morning after the insult, a stone from the same ring fort as the hearth's border. It's a symbol of the home's foundation in Brihan symbolism. To step on such a stone within another's hearth was to step on their dothract, their grounded dignity. It was a silent test of recognition. Brannon said nothing, but he understood. Compensation without coin fine declared that Brannon owed Aid and Doilik not a cow, nor silver, but an act of warmth. The phrase was deliberate, referred to an old custom of Tiana, Tidehead, the warmth gift, instead of money or goods. The offender would restore honor by performing acts of domestic service for 3 days, tending the fire, preparing food, sweeping, and welcoming guests. Brennan would become, briefly, the firekeeper, the one role he had insulted. He did not resist, nor did he boast. He simply nodded, and the judgment was done. No parchment, no seal, just ash, a footstep, and a woman's memory. How can a pile of ash say so much, and yet so few remember its language. Right? Other forms of justice have we lost, ones that did not punish, but restored. The judgment had been passed, not with swords, fines, or angry words, but with a quiet gesture. Brandon, the offending cousin, would repay his insult by serving as the firekeeper in the home he had dishonored. For 3 days, he would sweep the floor he had mocked, tend the fire he had ridiculed, and offer food with the same warmth he had once doubted. It was not a punishment of humiliation, but a path toward rebalancing. And in medieval Irish life, where so much law was entwined with kinship and gesture, such balances mattered more than gold. The hearth was, in its quiet way, a courtroom with no benches, a confessional with no priest, a place where human pride could be softened by the patience of ritual and the faint sting of smoke in the eyes. And now the second part of our story begins, not with thunder or rebellion, but with Brandon's first morning as a firekeeper. Day 1. The flame refuses to reset. Brandon rose before dawn. Just as the sky outside the thatched roof bled from charcoal into cold gray. The home was still quiet, save for the restless stirring of a rooster far off toward the edge of the Taith. He shuffled toward the hearth, its embers faint and buried in soft ash. His breath was visible in the air, misting slightly as he crouched down. There was a peat block beside the ring of stones, laid there by Aid the night before. Just as any host would prepare for morning heat, Brandon took the kindling, twisted bundles of dried rushes, and tried to coax the embers back to life. It would not catch. He blew gently. He poked and turned. The rushes smoked but would not flame. From the corner, a quiet voice stirred. "Doilik, you must find the breath of the fire first. It's under the ash, not above it." He nodded, humbled. He reached lower this time, stirring the heart of the hearth with care. The embers responded, a few faint sparks, then orange fingers reaching out. He placed the rushes again and blew, slowly, steadily. This time, the fire answered. The first duty of the hearthkeeper fulfilled. He prepared the porridge without flair, just oats, water, and salt. He ladled it with both hands, not speaking. When Aid entered, Brandon offered the bowl in silence. He did not apologize. That was not required. The act itself, feeding the one he had insulted, was the apology. By midday, Brandon swept the floor in slow, measured arcs. Irish homes of the time rarely had wooden floors. Most were hardened earth, sometimes covered with rushes, sometimes bare. The hearth ash, if allowed to spread, would stain the clay. But if handled well, it could become part of the floor itself, pressed down over time, preserving warmth and memory. And in that day's sweeping, Brandon found something odd. A small stone, oval and blackened, with a cross etched faintly into its face. He brought it to Doilik. "Did you place this here?" She shook her head, slowly. "That's not mine." Aid examined it and nodded. "That stone belonged to my father. He kept it near the fire when guests arrived. He said, it kept truth close and boasts far." Brandon said nothing, but he left the stone on the hearth's edge, a new, silent witness. Day 2, remembering the fire of others. The second morning, Brandon lit the fire more easily, learned the trick, how to lean just far enough, how to shield the wind from the flame. With his palm, he poured water with better aim. The porridge even had a few berries this time, offered by a child who had come visiting and left a basket later that day. A visitor arrived, a woman named Sarnet, known as a gatherer of herbs and a weaver of linen. She was not kin, but she entered without hesitation. The hearth had been declared warm again. She did not come for food, or for shelter from the wind, which had turned harsh as she sat by the hearth. She looked at Brandon and smiled faintly. "I heard you were tending the fire. I wanted to see if it still listens." He gave her a bowl and a seat. She gazed into the flames for some time, then spoke. My own hearth was once judged, many years ago, not for insult, but for absence. My husband was taken by fever, and I could not keep the fire lit through the morning. It was said that I let the spirits go cold, that I dishonored his death. She stirred the ashes with a stick as she spoke, so I brought warmth to others for a month. I carried peat from the bog, mended kettles, swept corners, not my own, and they forgave me. Brannon nodded. The hearth could be wronged, not just by insult, but by neglect, and repair came not from words, but labor. The law of warmth, then the legal tracts of the time, duties of hospitality were codified with astonishing detail. The hearth was legally protected. Not only could a hearth be shamed, it could be compensated according to the breadth of crowledge and breadth of it. Get, if a guest insulted the warmth of a home, or if a host failed to provide food or fire to a guest of equal status, the balance of honor could be measured in the number of meals denied or insulted. The number of days of fire was not kept at proper heat. The reputation of the hearthkeeper among neighboring Twada, even the ashes themselves, could serve as testimony. Ash patterns told stories. A hearth that had been disturbed hastily or with too many feet suggested chaos or tension. A neat hearth with no sign of disruption meant harmony. Brannon had begun to understand this. On the second night, he reshaped the edge of the ash ring into a crescent, an old symbol of renewal in Irish custom. He did not say why, but Doilick noticed. She left a fresh rush mat near his sleeping place. Day 3, the last kindling on the third morning. Brannon rose before the birds. The fire had nearly died in the night, but he relit it with practiced calm. This time, he used the oldest trick, a bit of crumbled dried moss tucked under the peat. Caught like magic, as the day unfolded, neighbors visited, not to judge, but to witness. One brought salted fish, another ale. One old woman brought a branch of hawthorn and placed it above the hearth as protection. Brannon welcomed each of them. He told no tales. He juggled no knives. He simply offered food and fire. By evening, "It's fine," returned the woman who had judged his insult days before. She sat near the hearth and asked for porridge. He served her silently. She ate slowly, then stood. "The fire is warm," she said aloud, for all to hear. "And the hearth remembers no insult." She turned to Brannon. "Will you sleep by the fire tonight, or return to your road?" He paused. "Tonight, I'll stay. Tomorrow, I'll carry the ashes to the old ring fort." This was another gesture of respect, to return hearth ash to the ancestral stones it once came from, to thank the land for its witness. Aid and Doilick said nothing, but as Brannon settled for the night, he placed the blackened stone beside him, the one etched with the cross, and so the hearth slept. Why do we no longer mark insults with ash, or heal shame with warmth? How many modern apologies could be shaped not with words, but with quiet service by the fire, by the fire. The ash pile Brannon gathered that morning was small, just the remains of 3 mornings of peat, kindling, and slow-burning reconciliation. But in medieval Ireland, even ashes had memory. They clung to the fingers with stories. They marked clothing with intention. They followed a man long after he'd left the fire. The third night had passed in silence, not out of discomfort, but peace. When Brannon rose before the first light, he gathered the cooled hearth ash into a carved wooden bowl that had once held honeyed oats. He wrapped it in cloth and tucked it into a satchel made from woven flax and wool. Nothing ceremonial, just practical. And then he stepped outside. The mist still clung to the fields, not yet warmed by sun. Behind him, the hearth glowed faintly. Aid and Doilick had not risen yet. There was no need. He would return the ash alone, and this was the final ritual. Not a rite handed down by clergy or written in vellum, but an old custom, older than memory, rooted in the land. You burned the fire where the insult was made. You carried the ash to where the ancestors watched. and you left it there as witness. It was said in some regions that if you carried hearth ash to the ringfort and spoke no words, the earth would forgive the transgression, but only if the fire had been kept true. The ringfort that watched and forgot Brennan followed the narrow track out of the settlement, across stone stiles and low wooden fences. The grass was damp, and his boots sank into the mossy edge of the trail. He passed the stream with the 3 stepping stones, one for truth, one for honor, one for silence. And then he reached it. The old arch. It was barely noticeable at first. Gentle rise in the field, crowned with hawthorn and birch. But if you knew where to look, you could see the arc of the old ditch. The embankment still wrapped around it like a shrugging shoulder of the land. This ringfort had no name now, but it had once been the seat of a Brehon, one of those wandering judges who memorized law with a rhythm like poetry, who settled quarrels not with swords, but with careful phrasing, and who slept beside sacred trees when words became too heavy to carry. Brannon stepped over the old stone entryway. There were no gates now, just 2 leaning posts and a path overgrown with clover and creeping thyme. The air smelled like iron and bark. It was cold, but welcoming. He walked to the center of the artige and removed the satchel. Kneeling on one knee, he untied the flax cord and unfolded the cloth. The ash had cooled fully gray, soft, almost like flour. He poured it gently onto the earth, forming a ring the size of a platter. Then he pressed his hand into the center of the ring. Not deep just enough to leave a print. This was how the fire told the land it had done its work. There were no witnesses. That was the point. He stayed there for a long time. Long enough for a bird to land nearby. Long enough for the mist to begin lifting. And then he walked back to the village. Empty-handed, but whole. The return of the hearthkeeper. That afternoon, the neighbors gathered again. Not for judgment. It's time for bread. The harvest season was ending. The apples had been dried. The last of the barley had been milled into flour. A bread feast, Aaron and Foamhair, was being held. The custom was simple. Each household brought bread made with their own flour, shaped into symbols: a circle for peace, a triangle for justice, a braid for long memory. They were placed around the central fire, broken by hand and shared in silence. When Brannon arrived, he carried no bread. Instead, he brought a hearth poker he had carved himself. Harsh wood, blackened at the tip, with a small knot handle at the end, shaped like a coiled flame. He offered it to Aid, who accepted it without words. And that was the end of the Rathden, the 3-day firekeeping ritual. From that moment on, Brannon's name was no longer followed by insult. He was simply a man who had once tended a fire in humility. And that was enough. The forgotten pages of hearth law historians rarely mention this part of medieval Irish life. The Brehon laws, so full of cattle values and land disputes, do reference hospitality and household order. But they do not capture the texture of what a hearth meant. Archaeological digs at early Guanias settlements have revealed hearths placed precisely in the geometric center of roundhouses, sometimes even aligned with sun markers. Charred wood found in middens shows a pattern of controlled burning, suggesting knowledge passed from host to host. In some cases, hearths were lined with quartz stones believed to carry the light of ancestors. In others, a small hole was left just above the fire, called Shil Na Tain, the eye of the fire, through which smoke exited and dreams were believed to travel. Even the layout of homes reinforced the centrality of fire. Beds ringed the outer edges, but the fire, always the fire, sat at the heart. And legal language followed this. A guest who slept farthest from the fire was of lower status, lest they were a brehon or bard, in which case they were placed closest for wisdom. An insult near the fire carried more weight than one outside. A fire unlit on the third night of mourning was considered an omen And so the law of the hearth was not written in pages, but in practice. In porridge, served without pride, in ashes carried on the wind, in silence. A hearth beyond time centuries later. The Ringford, where Brannan poured the ash, was plowed under. The hearth was moved. The laws changed. Ireland's oral traditions faded under the pressure of invasions, scriptural reforms, and economic change. But in some villages, especially in the West, you can still find traces. Grandmother who insists the fire be left burning when a guest is expected. A child taught to circle a kettle 3 times before setting it down. A hearthstone in an abandoned house, still black with soot. Someone once confessed a wrong with a pot of soup instead of an apology. The question that remains, what would it mean to repair our lives the way? Brannan did not with words, not with forced smiles, but with 3 days of quiet labor, 3 mornings of warmth, and the courage to carry the ashes to the past. What would it mean if we still believed that a hearth could hold the memory of justice? You may have heard of the Druids, the priests, the poets, the philosophers of ancient Ireland. Men and sometimes women who whispered incantations in sacred groves and measured time by the blooming of the hawthorn. But what you might not know is that in the world of early Irish law, the Druids were eventually overtaken by another class. The Fili. They were not warriors, nor were they monks, but they were the legal poets, the memory keepers, and their lives were not filled with chants or epic battles. They were filled with lists. Yes, lists. Long ones, lists of cattle prices, lists of body parts and their compensations, lists of trees by rank, lists of how many colors a noble's cloak must have. The Fili memorized them all, recited them in verse, sang them in quiet circles, and sometimes they slept near sacred trees so the words would stay in their heads just a little longer. This is the dull but necessary story of their lives. Let's start not in a grand hall, but in a sod-roofed house tucked into a hill on a morning when the mist had not yet lifted. The apprentice who counted branches, name was Lacton, the son of a small farmer in Ui, Maine, raised between bog and pasture, where the mornings smelled of sheep and last night's smoke. He was not strong, not fast, not particularly charming, but he could remember things, not just numbers, patterns, the sequence of who owed what after a boundary dispute, the order of fines when a pig trespassed into a nobleman's grain field, the full lineage of a half-forgotten chieftain from 5 generations ago, sung to the rhythm of a wooden spoon tapping a bowl when he was 9. A traveling Alma master poet and legal scholar passed through. His name was Irk. He had a crooked back and a voice like dry leaves, and he was looking for a new apprentice. He watched Lacton listen to a dispute over grazing rights and recite both sides word for word, and that was enough. Within a week, the boy was gone from the fields and walking behind Irk toward the mountains, to a small legal school made of stone and quietness. There was no chalkboard, no ink. There was only memory. The long road to legal Verstow, become a Fili, was not quick. It took 12 years, and in those 12 years, student memorized not just stories, but the very infrastructure of Irish society. First year, tree law. It started with the Breath of Comathesi, the law of the neighborhood. Time was handed. A poem. It was about trees, not poetic trees, legal trees. There were 28 species listed, divided into 4 classes, each with its own legal value. The nobles of the wood included oak, hazel, and yew. If someone cut down your oak, they owed you 1 milk cow. The second class, commoners of the wood, included apple and blackthorn, lesser fine. Then came lower divisions, and finally brushwood, like gorse and heather. It was dull, incredibly dull, but the rhythm helped. Everything rhymed in ways that made it easier to recall after long nights of sitting by the hearth. Chanting to the embers, Lacton learned that to harm a tree was to insult its owner, To damage a sacred tree, especially a lone bush on a burial mound, was to insult the land itself. By the end of the first year, he could recite all 28 species, their classifications, and defines for injury based on depth of cut, season of damage, and social status of the landholder. It wasn't poetry, it was order, and order. Medieval Ireland was sacred. Sacred groves and poetic sleep. When Lacton turned 15, he was told to prepare for his first night under the Fid Nemid, the sacred tree. This was not ritual for ritual's sake. It was how memory was tested. One slept beneath a revered tree, usually an oak or ash, standing alone, cut, believed to be touched by the gods or guarded by spirits. The filly would lie beneath it, having fasted and tried to recite all their legal verses in order. If they stumbled, they repeated the cycle. If they succeeded, the tree would remember with them. Some trees had histories of their own. The great oak of Falkirk had witnessed 6 generations of filly apprentices. Its bark was scarred where fingers had traced runes. Some said the roots whispered law in the dark. Lacton lay beneath a different tree, a hawthorn near Hilford, known not for grandeur, but for silence. He lay there for 3 nights, whispering lines until his breath matched the wind. When he returned, his teacher asked, "Did the tree speak?" Lacton answered, "No, but it stayed silent through my mistakes." That was the right answer. The dull wisdom of legal recitation. By his 7th year, Lacton could recite the bee judgments, the beck breathe in full. He knew if a bee stung a man and he died, the entire hive was executed. If bees trespassed on another man's flower meadow and honey was made from that nectar, the trespassed landowner was owed 1/3 of the honey. If a swarm settled in another man's tree, it could be claimed by the landowner only after 3 nights. Every law had conditions and exceptions to those conditions, and verses, always verses, because in a land where almost nothing was written down, the only defense against forgetfulness was rhythm. He learned the law of broken bones, of insult, of satire, of wrongful barking, dogs, and the size of cooking pots allowed in disputes. It wasn't exciting, it was comprehensive, and in a world without courts as we know them, this was how society remembered itself. The quiet ceremony of the 7th rank. By his 12th year, Lacton was ready. He had passed through the 7 degrees of the filly hierarchy. Falklock learner MacPhermot, son of composition Doss, sapling, Cano, small branch, Clee, weaving branch, and Ruth, noble stream, Olam, master, with each level, Clyde, his entitlement to food, land, and status increased. But so did the weight of what he carried, and now would take the seat reserved for law bards during village gatherings, not beside the chieftain, not near the warriors, but at the edge of the fire, where the satirists and judges sat quiet, patient, and ready to recite the law if called upon. His teacher gave him one last task. He was to walk alone for a week. No money, no food, only his verses, and each night he would sleep under a different sacred tree, repeating his verses aloud. He would not be graded. No one would watch, but the land would know. And so, Lacton walked the question that lingers. He passed through bogland, orchard, and glen. He lay beneath a yew, said to have grown beside a well cursed by an unloved king. He whispered the penalties for cattle raiding, for broken marriage contracts, for false poetry. And each morning he rose not with joy, but with structure. He was not a mystic, not a dreamer, just a keeper of the code. When he returned, no fanfare greeted him, laid a seat near the fire and a bowl of broth. That night, someone asked, "What is the fine for an insult delivered with a laughing tone?" Lacton answered, "If it causes no shame, 3, see if shame, 6. If the insult lingers beyond the day, 9. The others nodded, and the fire crackled. This is how order was kept it was kept. You may have heard of the Druids, okay? The priests, the poets, the philosophers of ancient Ireland. Men and sometimes women who whispered incantations in sacred groves and measured time by the blooming of the hawthorn. But what you might not know is that in the world of early Irish law, the Druids were eventually overtaken by another class. The Fili. They were not warriors, nor were they monks. They were the legal poets, the memory keepers, okay? And their lives were not filled with chants or epic battles. They were filled with lists. Yes, lists. Long ones, lists of cattle prices, lists of body parts and their compensations, lists of trees by rank, lists of how many colors a noble's cloak must have. The Fili memorized them all, recited them in verse, sang them in quiet circles, and sometimes they slept near sacred trees so the words would stay in their heads just a little longer. This is the dull but necessary story of their lives. Let's start not in a grand hall, but in a sod-roofed house tucked into a hill on a morning when the mist had not yet lifted. The apprentice who counted branches' name was Lacton, the son of a small farmer in Ui, Maine, raised between bog and pasture, where the mornings smelled of sheep and last night's smoke. He was not strong, not fast, not particularly charming, but he could remember things, not just numbers, patterns, the sequence of who owed what after a boundary dispute, the order of fines when a pig trespassed into a nobleman's grain field, the full lineage of a half-forgotten chieftain from 5 generations ago, sung to the rhythm of a wooden spoon tapping a bowl when he was 9. A traveling Alma master poet and legal scholar passed through. His name was Irk. He had a crooked back and a voice like dry leaves, and he was looking for a new apprentice. He watched Lacton listen to a dispute over grazing rights and recite both sides word for word, and that was enough. Within a week, the boy was gone from the fields and walking behind Irk toward the mountains, to a small legal school made of stone and quietness. There was no chalkboard, no ink. There was only memory. The long road to legal versto, become a Fili, was not quick. It took 12 years, and in those 12 years, student memorized not just stories, but the very infrastructure of Irish society. First year, tree law. It started with the Breath Comathesi, the law of the neighborhood. Time was handed. A poem. It was about trees, not poetic trees, legal trees. There were 28 species listed, divided into 4 classes, each with its own legal value. The nobles of the wood included oak, hazel, and yew. If someone cut down your oak, they owed you 1 milk cow. The second class, commoners of the wood, included apple and blackthorn, lesser fine. Then came lower divisions, and finally brushwood, like gorse and heather. It was dull, incredibly dull, but the rhythm helped. Everything rhymed in ways that made it easier to recall after long nights of sitting by the hearth, chanting to the embers. Lacting learned that to harm a tree was to insult its owner. To damage a sacred tree, especially a lone bush on a burial mound, was to insult the land itself. By the end of the first year, he could recite all 28 species, their classifications, and the fines for injury based on depth of cut, season of damage, and social status of the landholder. It wasn't poetry, it was order, and order. Medieval Ireland was sacred. Sacred groves and poetic sleep. When Lacton turned 15, he was told to prepare for his first night under the Fid Nemid, the sacred tree. This was not ritual for ritual's sake. It was how memory was tested. One slept beneath a revered tree, usually an oak or ash, standing alone, cut, believed to be touched by the gods or guarded by spirits. The Fili would lie beneath it, having fasted and tried to recite all their legal verses in order. If they stumbled, they repeated the cycle. If they succeeded, the tree would remember with them. Some trees had histories of their own. The great oak of Falkirk had witnessed 6 generations of Fili apprentices. Its bark was scarred, where fingers had traced runes. Some said the roots whispered law in the dark. Lacton lay beneath a different tree, a hawthorn near Hilford, known not for grandeur, but for silence. He lay there for 3 nights, whispering lines until his breath matched the wind. When he returned, his teacher asked, "Did the tree speak?" Lacton answered, "No, but it stayed silent through my mistakes." That was the right answer. The dull wisdom of legal recitation. By his 7th year, Lacton could recite the bee judgments, the beck breathe in full. He knew if a bee stung a man and he died, the entire hive was executed. If bees trespassed on another man's flower meadow and honey was made from that nectar, the trespassed landowner was owed 1/3 of the honey. If a swarm settled in another man's tree, it could be claimed by the landowner only after 3 nights. Every law had conditions and exceptions to those conditions, and verses, always verses, because in a land where almost nothing was written down, the only defense against forgetfulness was rhythm. He learned the law of broken bones, of insult, of satire, of wrongful barking, dogs, and the size of cooking pots allowed in disputes. It wasn't exciting, it was comprehensive, and in a world without courts as we know them, this was how society remembered itself. The quiet ceremony of the 7th rank. By his 12th year, Lacton was ready. He had passed through the 7 degrees of the Philly hierarchy. Falklock learner MacPhermott, son of composition Doss, sapling, Cano, small branch, Clee, weaving branch, and Ruth, noble stream, Olam, master, with each level. Clyde, his entitlement to food, land, and status increased, but so did the weight of what he carried, and now would take the seat reserved for law bards during village gatherings, not beside the chieftain, not near the warriors, but at the edge of the fire, where the satirists and judges sat quiet, patient, and ready to recite the law if called upon. His teacher gave him one last task. He was to walk alone for a week. No money, no food, only his verses, and each night he would sleep under a different sacred tree, repeating his verses aloud. He would not be graded. No one would watch, but the land would know. And so, Lacton walked the question that lingers. He passed through bogland, orchard, and glen. He lay beneath a yew, said to have grown beside a well cursed by an unloved king. He whispered the penalties for cattle raiding, for broken marriage contracts, for false poetry. And each morning he rose not with joy, but with structure. He was not a mystic, not a dreamer, just a keeper of the code. When he returned, no fanfare greeted him, lay a seat near the fire and a bowl of broth. That night, someone asked, "What is the fine for an insult delivered with a laughing tone?" Lacton answered, "If it causes no shame, 3, see if shame, 6. If the insult lingers beyond the day, 9. The others nodded, and the fire crackled. This is how order was kept. In the soft hush of an overcast morning, you might imagine the work of the Feely beginning with songbirds and soft robes, but it often began with someone knocking on a wooden threshold. The Feely did not live in high towers. They were not cloistered in monastic scriptoria. They lived in small timber houses on the edge of the Taith, the local kingdom or tribal territory. Their windows faced the fields, not the halls of kings. Their job, after all, was not glory. It was clarity. By the time Lacton returned to his village as a full Alama master, legal poet, his hair had started to thin. He had memorized over 300 legal verses and could interpret at least 6 different dialects of Old Irish law, but his voice remained quiet, his posture unremarkable. He was not feared, only remembered, because of Philly's power didn't come from authority. It came from being consulted. In the year he returned, disputes began almost immediately. The first dispute, a cow's shadow weight, began, as so many things did, with cattle. A young man named Kalen accused his neighbor of violating a grazing boundary. He claimed that 2 of his cows had been lured over with salted oats and that their calves, conceived during the trespass, should be declared illegitimate. To most, it sounded absurd, but not to a trained feelie. Lockton sat cross-legged on a blanket of rushes. He listened quietly as both parties spoke. No one shouted. Shouting was for warriors. When it was time to speak, he did not look up. The shadow of a cow, K, he said slowly, belongs to the land it touches. If the animal crossed only with its head, but the shadow remained on the rightful pasture, the fine is half. If the animal's hooves left tracks more than 3 paces beyond the border, the fine is full. If enticed, double. If unenticed, half. If salt was offered across a known boundary, the one who offered it owes a quarter of the calf's value. Everyone waited for him to finish. Then he looked up and added, lest the calf was born with one eye closed, in which case the ruling is reversed due to omen. They accepted his ruling, even if they didn't understand all of it. That was often the point. The role of obscurity. You might wonder why not make the laws easier. But ease was not the goal of early Irish law. Stability was. And in a world where nearly everything was oral, complexity acted as a kind of encryption. The more ornate the language, the harder it was to alter or misuse. And so, law poems were filled with metaphor, double meanings, obscure symbols. Only the feelie, trained for over a decade, could untangle them without distortion. Lacton recited the verse, if the cow crosses west, and the dew remains, the hoof is half, the calf is chains. No one quite knew what the last part meant, but it was remembered, repeated, and in that repetition, the boundaries of justice stayed firm. This was how order endured, not through clarity, but through consensus. The case of the wandering Pigleton, another case arrived in spring, when the wind still carried frost and the birch trees shed pale bark like paper from an old ledger. A woman named Una came with a complaint. Her piglet, barely 2 moons old, had wandered into her neighbor's dye pit. The dye was made from alder bark, mixed with stale urine and iron filings. The piglet had emerged red. Not just stained, but transformed. The neighbor, a weaver named Braun, now claimed the piglet as his own. The key said the color was unnatural, and, therefore, the animal must be reborn and reowned. Una argued it was still her piglet, red or not. They brought the piglet to Lacton. It squealed and trembled in his lap. He listened carefully. Then he called for 3 elders and 2 children. They were asked to look at the piglet and draw its shape in ash on the ground from memory. When they finished, he compared the drawings. 4 of the 5 matched an earlier piglet sketch Una had drawn weeks ago for her nephew. The 5th, drawn by a child, showed wings. Lacton looked at Brana. Let this be known, he said gently, that dye does not erase lineage, nor does color alter kinship. The piglet remains with Una. He paused, then added, unless it learns to fly, in which case we will reconsider. Everyone chuckled softly, but the ruling stood, and once again the law held. Why, the feelie slept. Near trees, the sacred trees oaks use hawthorns. Even apple trees in some regions weren't just for rituals. They were anchors. In the absence of scrolls and parchments, a feelie used the natural world to reinforce memory. Each type of tree held a category of law and oral tradition. Land law, boundaries and trespass. Crimes of violence and blood fines. Hazel, contracts, debts and agreements. Cash, cattle law, compensation and property. Hawthorn, family disputes, honor and satire. Sleeping beneath a tree was a method of mental organization. The scent, the wind, the texture of bark day, all acted as mnemonic devices. When Lacton needed to remember the 7 gradations of satirical insult, he returned to a hawthorn grove. When he needed clarity on cross-border grazing compensation, he lay beneath an ash tree. No ink, no books, just bark and breath. That was the archive to satirist's dilemma one evening. Traveling satirist named Ernie came to the village. He was young, loud, and full of rhymes that bordered on insults. Satire in early Irish culture was no joke. It was legally binding. A powerful enough satire could cause real physical blemishes to appear on a person's face, or so it was believed. The shame alone could alter a man's reputation forever. Ernie had written a biting verse about the local chieftain's cooking. It went, "He boils the bones and serves them thin. The flavor's gone, but pride stays in." The chieftain laughed, but his wife did not. She demanded redress. Satire, when unwarranted, was a crime. Lockton was summoned again. He listened to the verse. He measured the laughter against the offense. He consulted a poem from his youth. If insult cuts and faces red, to seem fine in words unsaid. If shame does bloom and reputation sags, for seat more and 2 black flags. He ruled that the verse had caused a mild insult, but no lasting shame. The satirist would pay a symbolic fine, 2 loaves of barley bread and an apology, delivered in verse. Ernie complied. His new verse was softer. The broth is warm, the welcome kind. My tongue was sharp, but heart was blind. The chieftain's wife accepted. In order, once again, was gently restored. The strange law of doorsteps late in the year. As rains turned the soil to a sluggish porridge, Lacton was awoken early one morning. A man named Dancha had died unexpectedly, and his body had fallen across the threshold of his brother's house. The question arose, did the body die inside the house or outside? This mattered because compensation for death in one's home was greater than for death in open ground. In the doorway was a liminal zone. Neither here nor there, Lacton measured the angle of the knees, the position of the hands, the direction of the final breath, if witnesses could be believed. Then he recited, where the soul did flee, there lies the debt. If half in, half out, the sun must set. On the 3rd day's rise, if foot is dry, then blood price paid shall not be high. Waited, the 3rd morning came. The foot was still wet. That meant the soul had left indoors. The brother paid the full earache, or blood fine, to the kin. No one protested. Even the widow wept in silence, because the law had spoken, and the tree had remembered. The open question asked. Lacton sat by the hearth that evening. He traced a circle in ash with his finger. Around him, young students recited poems about bee stings, broken fences, and the insult of a turned back. They did not laugh. They repeated again and again, and as he drifted into sleep, his head resting against a block of wood polished smooth from years of leaning, he wondered quietly, would anyone, generations from now, still remember these verses? Would a world filled with ink and books with scribes and scrolls still find room for memory kept in bark and rhyme? Or would it all be forgotten like footprints in peat after rain?